December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. The Japanese Zero fighter sweeps across the Pacific like an unstoppable katana, slicing through American defenses with contemptuous ease. American pilots climbing into their Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman F4F Wildcats know they're flying coffins. The Mitsubishi A6M0 outturns them, outclimbs them, outmaneuvers them in every conceivable way. Japanese pilots laugh through their oxygen masks as they watch the clumsy American aircraft attempt to dogfight. It's like watching a freight train try to dance with a hummingbird. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, leading the Pearl Harbor fighter escort, would later write in his diary, "The American fighters rose to meet us like fat ducks trying to escape a falcon. We destroyed them before they understood what was happening." This wasn't mere propaganda or battlefield exaggeration. The combat statistics from December 1941 through June 1942 paint a devastating picture of American aerial inferiority. In the skies over the Philippines, Wake Island, Java, and the Coral Sea, Japanese Zeros achieved kill ratios that defy belief, sometimes 20-1. Sometimes 30-1 against American aircraft. The Zero's dominance wasn't accidental. It was the product of ruthless Japanese engineering philosophy that prioritized performance over everything else, including pilot survival. Weighing just 5,000 pounds fully loaded compared to the Wildcat 7,800 pounds, the Zero could turn inside any American fighter, climb faster, and operate at ranges that seemed impossible to American tacticians who couldn't believe an enemy fighter could escort bombers on 800-mile missions. The secret was brutal simplicity: no armor plating protecting the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundant systems. Every ounce was dedicated to speed, range, and maneuverability. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros in early 1942 told stories that sounded like mythology. Lieutenant Edward Hare, one of the few early American aces, described his first Zero encounter over a bull. "I put 50 rounds into him at close range. Saw the tracers walking right up his fuselage. He didn't even smoke. Just pulled up in a loop so tight I couldn't follow, came down on my 6, and nearly killed me. I ducked for cloud cover and thanked God I was still breathing." Hare survived because he refused to dogfight, but hundreds of his fellow pilots died trying to turn with an opponent that could literally fly circles around them. The psychological impact of Zero superiority devastated American morale across the Pacific theater. Pilots developed what flight surgeons would later categorize as acute anxiety disorders before even reaching their aircraft. Ground crews watched their friends take off and bet on who wouldn't return. The statistically average survival time for a Navy fighter pilot in the first 6 months of 1942 was measured in weeks, not months or years. Something had to change, and change fundamentally, or Japan would achieve air superiority so complete that any American counteroffensive would be impossible. Grumman's engineers receive a death sentence disguised as a contract in the spring of 1942, while American forces were still reeling from defeat after defeat. A small team of engineers at Grumman Aircraft Corporation on Long Island received what appeared to be an impossible assignment from the United States Navy Bureau of Aeronautics. Design and build a fighter aircraft that could defeat the Zero in every combat scenario. Make it fast enough to catch Zeros trying to escape. Make it maneuverable enough to survive close combat. Make it tough enough to absorb 20mm cannon shells and keep flying. Make it powerful enough to carry bombs for ground attack. Make it simple enough that 18-year-old farm boys could maintain it on a pitching carrier deck in the middle of a typhoon. And do it all in less than 18 months. Roy Grumman, the company's founder, looked at the specifications and told his chief engineer, William Schwendler, "They're asking us to violate the laws of physics." Schwendler, who had designed the stubby, durable F4F Wildcat that was currently being shot to pieces over the Pacific, understood the magnitude of the challenge. Every design choice involved brutal trade-offs. More armor meant less speed. Bigger guns meant less ammunition. Longer range meant heavier fuel loads that reduced climb rate. The Zero had solved these problems by eliminating protection entirely. Grumman's team would need to find another way. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: captured Zero wreckage. In July 1942, an intact Zero crash-landed in the Aleutian Islands after its pilot was killed by ground fire. American engineers descended on the aircraft like forensic scientists examining a murder weapon. They measured every dimension, weighed every component, tested the engine, analyzed the metallurgy. What they discovered was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. The Zero's phenomenal performance came from its lack of protection, but this same design philosophy meant that a Zero hit by heavy machine gun fire didn't just get damaged, it disintegrated. Japanese pilots flew aircraft that would burn like gasoline-soaked paper if American guns could land solid hits. Schwendler's team made a revolutionary decision. Instead of trying to outturn the Zero, they would build a fighter that could survive long enough to kill it. The design that emerged from Grumman's Long Island facility looked like a flying tank compared to the Zero's elegant simplicity. The F6F Hellcat would carry over 200 pounds of armor plating protecting the pilot from front, sides, and below. Self-sealing fuel tanks would prevent fires when punctured. A massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Zero's output, would be surrounded by additional armor plating to prevent single shots from destroying the aircraft's power source. The weight penalty was enormous. The Hellcat would tip the scales at over 12,000 pounds loaded for combat, nearly 2.5 times heavier than a Zero. Naval aviators reviewing the preliminary designs were skeptical to the point of hostility. Lieutenant Commander Paul Ramsey, who had survived the Battle of Midway flying a Wildcat, looked at the Hellcat mock-up and said flatly, "That thing's a flying warehouse. The Zero will fly circles around it just like it does to us now." But Grumman's engineers had done their mathematics carefully. The Hellcat wouldn't turn with a Zero. It would dive on Zeros from above, using superior speed and energy retention to control engagement geometry. If a Zero tried to run, the Hellcat would chase it down with raw power. If a Zero tried to dogfight, the Hellcat would absorb punishment that would destroy 3 Zeros and keep shooting back. The Navy, desperate for anything that might shift the balance of aerial combat, approved the design in June 1942 and demanded the first production aircraft by December. This timeline was insane by conventional manufacturing standards. Creating an entirely new fighter aircraft typically required 3 to 4 years from initial design to combat deployment. Grumman had 7 months to design, test, and begin mass production of an aircraft that would determine whether the United States could take back control of Pacific skies or watch the Japanese Zero continue its bloody reign of aerial dominance. Birth of a killer, 6 months that changed naval aviation forever. The first XF6F-1 prototype rolled out of Grumman's facility in September 1942, just 4 months after design approval. Test pilot Robert Hall climbed into the cockpit on September 26 for the maiden flight, fully aware that he was flying an aircraft that had never been wind tunnel tested at combat speeds, whose systems had never been proven under actual flight loads, and whose engine installation was so new that even Pratt & Whitney engineers weren't certain about heat dissipation characteristics. Hall pushed the throttle forward, felt the massive double Wasp engine roar to life with a sound like continuous thunder, and lifted a fighter aircraft that would ultimately be responsible for destroying more Japanese aircraft than any other American weapon system into the sky. For the first time, the test flight revealed both promise and problems. The Hellcat was fast, Hall reached 375 miles per hour in level flight at 19,000 feet, faster than a Zero's maximum speed at any altitude. The controls were responsive and well harmonized despite the aircraft's weight. Visibility from the cockpit was excellent thanks to a bubble canopy that gave pilots nearly 360 degrees of visual awareness. But the climb rate was disappointing, and handling characteristics at high angles of attack suggested the aircraft might be dangerous in the hands of inexperienced pilots during carrier approaches. Grumman's engineers worked with frantic intensity to solve these problems. The engine was upgraded from the initial 2,000 horsepower I-2800-10 to the more powerful A-2800-10W with water injection that could produce 2,200 horsepower for combat emergencies. The wing design was refined to improve low-speed handling. The propeller was optimized for better thrust at combat altitudes. Every change had to be tested, validated, and incorporated into production aircraft without delaying the manufacturing timeline. Grumman's facilities operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers slept in the factories. Engineers lived on coffee and determination. By January 1943, production Hellcats were rolling off assembly lines at a rate that seemed impossible to Japanese intelligence analysts who would later examine captured American documents. Where the Japanese aircraft industry struggled to produce 300 Zeros per month despite simplified construction and minimal quality control, Grumman was producing over 600 Hellcats monthly with far more complex systems and stricter quality requirements. This wasn't just manufacturing, it was industrial warfare on a scale that Japanese planners had never imagined possible. American factories were producing fighter aircraft faster than Japanese training programs could replace their experienced pilots. The first Hellcats reached combat squadrons in February 1943. VF-9 aboard the carrier USS Essex received their new aircraft with mixed feelings. The pilots, accustomed to the nimble but fragile Wildcat, found the Hellcat felt like flying a truck compared to their previous mount. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhirter, who would become one of the Navy's leading aces, remembered his first impression: it was big. It was heavy. It didn't feel like a fighter plane. But when you pushed that throttle forward and felt 2,000 horsepower shoving you back in the seat, when you rolled into a dive and watched the airspeed indicator climb past 400 knots, you started to understand what Grumman had built. This wasn't a plane that would dance with Zeros. This was a plane that would smash Zeros into the ocean and ask for more. Training doctrine developed rapidly as pilots learned to exploit the Hellcat's unique capabilities. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued tactical bulletins based on combat reports from the few early Hellcat engagements. Never turn with a Zero, use vertical maneuvers and speed to control engagement geometry. Never let a Zero get on your 6 in a sustained chase, brake hard, use the Hellcat's superior roll rate at high speed to reverse position. Maintain altitude advantage whenever possible. The Hellcat's power-to-weight ratio gave it superior zoom climb capability that could convert excess speed into altitude faster than a Zero could follow. Work in pairs. While one Hellcat engaged, his wingman positioned for a killing shot, Marcus Island, where Zeros met their nemesis August 31, 1943. The carrier USS Essex, with VF-9's Hellcat spotted on deck, launched the first major combat operation for Grumman's new fighter against Japanese installations on Marcus Island, an isolated fortress 1,200 miles east of Japan itself. The mission was designated as a combat evaluation, test the Hellcat under real combat conditions against experienced Japanese pilots flying the latest Zero variants. 16 Hellcats launched into clear Pacific skies, formed up in divisions of 4 aircraft each, and headed west toward an island where Japanese radar operators were already tracking their approach and scrambling interceptors. Lieutenant Commander Herbert Hauck led the formation, knowing that everything his pilots had learned in training was about to be tested against an enemy that had spent 2 years perfecting the art of killing American aviators. As the Hellcats approached Marcus Island at 18,000 feet, Japanese Zeros from the 752nd Air Group rose to meet them, 24 aircraft flown by combat veterans who had fought over China, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands. The Japanese pilots saw the unfamiliar American aircraft and initially assumed they were looking at another variant of the Wildcat, an opponent they had learned to destroy with contemptuous ease. The first pass shattered that assumption. Hauck's division dove on a formation of 8 Zeros that were climbing to intercept. The Hellcats accelerated in the dive to speeds the Zeros couldn't match, closed to 400 yards, and opened fire with all 650 caliber machine guns. The standard Hellcat armament, 6 Browning M2 machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, could fire 2,400 rounds collectively, creating a stream of half-inch projectiles that converged into a cone of destruction where any aircraft caught inside would be shredded in seconds. The lead Zero, struck by multiple rounds, exploded in a fireball that startled both Japanese and American pilots with its intensity. The engagement dissolved into a chaotic melee that lasted 18 minutes and ranged from sea level to 25,000 feet. Japanese pilots attempted their standard tactics, tight-turning dogfights where the Zero's legendary maneuverability would dominate. But the Hellcat pilots refused to play that game. When Zeros turned to engage, Hellcats dove away, building speed, then zoomed back up to altitude for another attack. When Zeros tried to escape, Hellcats chased them down with superior speed and diving performance. When Zeros got behind Hellcats, the American pilots rolled hard at high speed, a maneuver the heavier Hellcat could execute faster than the lighter Zero due to superior aileron authority and reversed position. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, flying as Hauck's wingman, described one engagement that demonstrated the Hellcat's lethality. I dove on a Zero that was trying to get on the skipper's tail. Came down on him at probably 450 miles per hour. He saw me and tried to turn away, but at that speed, he couldn't turn fast enough. I put a 1-second burst into him from maybe 200 yards. Saw the tracers hit his wing root, walk up the fuselage. He came apart in the air. Wing separated, fuselage tumbled, pilot never got out. Took me maybe 5 seconds from starting my dive to killing him. That's what the Hellcat did. It gave you the power to control when and how you fought. When the surviving Hellcats returned to Essex, the results stunned even the optimistic. 11 confirmed, 0 kills, 3 probables, 2 damaged. Not a single Hellcat lost, though several showed battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Hauck's aircraft had taken 7 20mm cannon shell hits, including 2 that punched through the armor plate behind his seat, and he flew it back to the carrier for a normal landing. Another pilot, Ensign Richard Stambuk, had his left aileron shot completely off and landed safely using rudder and right aileron only. The Hellcat's structural toughness was proving exactly what Grumman's engineers had designed. The Marcus Island battle report reached Pearl Harbor and then Washington within hours. Naval aviators across the Pacific who had spent 18 months dodging Zeros and watching friends die read the combat summaries with something approaching religious fervor. An American fighter had finally arrived that could meet the Zero on equal terms and destroy it. The kill ratio from Marcus Island, 11-0, would prove prophetic. Over the next 2 years, Hellcats would maintain an overall kill ratio against Japanese aircraft of 19-1, the most dominant performance of any fighter aircraft in any theater of World War II. The Thatch We've meets unstoppable force. Commander John Jimmy Thatch, who had developed the famous Thatch-Weave defensive tactic that allowed Wildcats to survive against numerically superior Zeros, watched the Hellcat combat reports with fascination and began developing new offensive tactics specifically designed to exploit the new fighter's capabilities. The Thatch-Weave had been born of desperation, a way for inferior aircraft to protect each other through mutual support and overlapping fields of fire. The Hellcat didn't need defensive tactics. It needed offensive tactics that would allow it to hunt Zeros aggressively and destroy them in maximum numbers with minimum risk. Thatch proposed a formation he called the mowing machine, which organized Hellcats in staggered altitude layers that could pounce on Japanese formations from multiple angles simultaneously while maintaining enough vertical separation to avoid collisions during high-speed diving attacks. The top layer would dive first, disrupting the enemy formation and forcing Japanese pilots to break defensive positions. The middle layer would attack aircraft breaking away from the first pass. The bottom layer would catch anyone diving to escape, using the Hellcat's superior diving speed to run down fleeing Zeros that would have easily escaped Wildcats. VF-2, the famous Ripper's Squadron, became the first unit to implement Thatch's tactics during operations over the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. Commander William Dean led 24 Hellcats against an estimated 40 Japanese aircraft defending Tarawa Atoll. The Japanese formation included not just Zeros but also newer Nakajima Kyo-84 Frank fighters that Japanese pilots considered superior to the Zero in several performance categories. Dean's Hellcats executed the mowing machine tactic perfectly, hitting the Japanese formation in 3 successive waves from 25,000 feet down to 5,000 feet in less than 90 seconds. The Japanese formation disintegrated under the assault. Pilots who tried to turn and fight found Hellcats diving on them from above before they could complete their turns. Pilots who dove to escape ran into the lower Hellcat formations, diving even faster. Pilots who tried to maintain altitude were overwhelmed by the sheer number of Hellcats attacking simultaneously. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, 31 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, including 17 Zeros and 5 of the supposedly superior Franks, for the loss of 2 Hellcats, 1 to ground fire and 1 to a mid-air collision with a Zero during a firing pass. Lieutenant Commander Robert Duncan, who shot down 4 Zeros in that single engagement, described the evolution of tactics. In the Wildcat, we fought to survive. Every engagement was about staying alive long enough to maybe get 1 kill. In the Hellcat, we fought to kill. Every engagement was about maximizing the number of enemy aircraft we could destroy before they could escape or get organized. It was a completely different mentality. We became predators instead of prey, and the Japanese pilots could feel the difference. The tactical revolution didn't stop with formations. Hellcat pilots developed specific techniques for every type of engagement. If a Zero tried to sucker a Hellcat into a low-speed turning fight, the standard response was to extend vertically, zoom straight up using excess energy, then roll over at the top and dive back down with even more speed for another pass. If multiple Zeros tried to box in a lone Hellcat, the pilot would roll inverted and pull through into a split S, diving away so fast that pursuing Zeros would have to abandon the chase or risk overstressing their lighter airframes trying to follow. If a Hellcat got on a Zero's tail in a chase, the standard technique was to fire a short burst early, forcing the Zero to brake and maneuver, then use the Hellcat's superior roll rate to follow the brake and fire the killing burst while the Zero was still in the turn. Task Force 58, the Hellcat's floating fortress. By January 1944, the United States Navy had assembled the most powerful carrier strike force in history. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, consisted of 17 aircraft carriers, 6 fleet carriers and 11 light carriers, carrying over 900 aircraft, of which nearly 400 were Hellcats. This concentration of naval air power was unprecedented. The entire Japanese carrier force at the war's beginning had operated 400 aircraft total. Now a single American task force brought 400 Hellcats alone, supported by dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. The carriers themselves had evolved to support intensive Hellcat operations. Deck crews could launch a full strike group, 36 Hellcats plus supporting aircraft, in less than 15 minutes. Recovery operations could land aircraft at intervals of under 30 seconds, meaning a full returning strike group could be back aboard in 20 minutes. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the Hellcats combat ready. The average time from landing with battle damage to being declared ready for the next mission was less than 8 hours even for aircraft with significant structural damage, a testament to both Grumman's rugged design and the skill of Navy maintenance personnel. The logistics of keeping Task Force 58's Hellcats flying were staggering. Each Hellcat consumed roughly 200 gallons of aviation fuel per combat mission. 400 Hellcats flying 2 missions per day consumed 160,000 gallons of fuel daily, the equivalent of 16 tanker trucks. Ammunition requirements were equally impressive, with each Hellcat carrying 2,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. A single Alpha strike consumed nearly 1 million rounds. Supply ships had to deliver constant streams of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement aircraft to maintain operations. Admiral Mitchell, observing Hellcat operations from the flag bridge of USS Lexington, understood that the Hellcat had fundamentally changed naval warfare. Previous carrier operations had been limited by the short range and vulnerability of earlier fighters. Task Force 58 could project power hundreds of miles inland with confidence that Hellcat combat air patrols would protect the carriers from Japanese counterattacks. The Hellcat's combination of range, it could fly combat patrols lasting over 4 hours with fuel reserves, and combat effectiveness meant that American carriers could operate with aggressive confidence that would have been suicidal in early war conditions. The Japanese Navy, monitoring American carrier movements, understood they faced an existential threat. Radio intercepts revealed Japanese commanders using new terminology to describe American air attacks: Kurai Nikko Kageki, Black Cat Offensive, their designation for Hellcat-led strikes. Japanese pilots developed superstitious rituals before missions, knowing that encounters with Hellcats were increasingly likely to be fatal. The psychological impact of Hellcat superiority began affecting Japanese tactical decisions. Commanders became reluctant to send aircraft against American forces even when tactical situations demanded aggressive responses, because the loss rates were becoming unsustainable. Operation Hailstone, Truck Lagoon's Day of Reckoning. February 17, 1944. Truck Lagoon in the Caroline Islands, called the Gibraltar of the Pacific by American intelligence, housed Japan's most important forward naval base. Over 40 merchant ships and support vessels crowded the anchorage. 365 Japanese aircraft operated from 4 airfields. The base was considered impregnable, protected by anti-aircraft batteries, fighter patrols, and early warning radar stations that could detect approaching aircraft from over 100 miles away. Admiral Mitchell's Task Force 58, with 12 carriers and over 450 Hellcats, was going to eliminate it in a single day. The attack began at dawn. The first wave, 72 Hellcats escorting dive bombers and torpedo planes, flew at wave-top height to avoid radar detection until the last possible moment. The Japanese radar operators on truck detected massed aircraft approaching from the east at 0630 local time and sounded general quarters. Every available Zero scrambled to intercept, approximately 80 aircraft rising from four airfields simultaneously in the largest Japanese defensive effort in months. The Japanese pilots, confident in their numerical advantage and the protective umbrella of ground-based anti-aircraft fire, climbed to meet the Americans, expecting a conventional carrier strike that would involve some losses but ultimately be driven off by determined defense. What happened instead was systematic annihilation. The Hellcats, no longer needing to maintain formation with the slower bombers, accelerated to combat speed and climbed rapidly to altitude advantage. Commander David McCampbell, leading VF-15 from USS Essex, later described the tactical situation: "We came in from the east with the rising sun behind us. The Zeros were silhouetted against the dawn, climbing in loose formations, probably thinking they had plenty of time to organize before we got there. We didn't give them that time. Dove on them from 19,000 feet while they were still at 12,000, hit them before they knew we were attacking. The first pass destroyed 16 Zeros in less than 45 seconds. The Japanese formation, caught climbing and accelerating, had no energy to maneuver defensively. Hellcats diving at over 450 miles per hour simply shot through the formation, each pilot selecting a target, firing a burst of under 2 seconds, and watching the target disintegrate before zooming back up to altitude for another attack. The Japanese pilots attempted to scatter and reform, but the Hellcat divisions followed relentlessly, maintaining the altitude advantage, using speed and power to control every engagement. On the ground, Japanese aircraft attempting to take off faced impossible odds. Hellcats from the second and third waves established combat air patrols over each airfield, shooting down aircraft during their takeoff rolls before they could retract landing gear or build up defensive speed. Lieutenant Cecil Harris of VF-2 strafed one runway 8 times, destroying 4 Zeros on the ground and shooting down 3 more attempting to take off. His Hellcat absorbed 23 hits from ground fire, including one 20mm shell that punched through his left wing without hitting critical structure, and he flew it back to the carrier for a normal landing. The air battle over Truk lasted 6 hours and involved over 300 American and Japanese aircraft in continuous combat. When the surviving Hellcats returned to their carriers that afternoon, the results exceeded even optimistic predictions. 270 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 127 shot down in aerial combat, 143 destroyed on the ground. 37 ships sunk, including 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers caught in the lagoon by dive bombers operating under Hellcat protection. American losses: 25 aircraft to all causes, including only 4 Hellcats shot down by enemy fighters. The other Hellcat losses were to anti-aircraft fire so intense that one pilot described it as flying through a thunderstorm made of steel. The Battle of Truk marked a turning point in the Pacific Air War. Japanese commanders realized that concentrating aircraft for defense no longer provided the numerical advantage necessary to defeat American carrier strikes. The Hellcat's combination of performance, protection, and firepower meant that even outnumbered 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, Hellcat formations could destroy Japanese defenders and maintain air superiority over target areas. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrew morale was devastating. Pilots who survived Truk described the Hellcats as Akuma, demons that couldn't be stopped by conventional defensive tactics. The Marianas Turkey Shoot: maximum violence at industrial scale. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's Japanese mobile fleet, with 9 aircraft carriers and 430 aircraft, sortied to destroy American forces invading Saipan. This was Japan's last opportunity to achieve a decisive carrier battle victory that might force a negotiated peace. Ozawa's pilots had trained extensively, studying combat reports from every major engagement. They knew the Hellcat's capabilities, knew they couldn't dogfight it, knew their best chance was coordinated mass attacks that would overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. They launched their strike groups with confidence born of desperation. This was their last chance to change the course of the Pacific War. Admiral Mitch's Task Force 58 had 15 carriers and 900 aircraft, including 480 Hellcats. American radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 140 miles, providing nearly 30 minutes warning. That warning time proved catastrophic for the Japanese. Instead of catching American aircraft spotted on carrier decks, the Japanese strike groups flew into a three-dimensional ambush where over 200 Hellcats waited at altitude with perfect situational awareness of Japanese positions, numbers, and attack vectors. The Combat Air Patrol Commander, Commander Charles Brewer, orchestrated the defensive response with ruthless efficiency. Hellcat divisions were stacked from 15,000 to 30,000 feet, positioned to intercept multiple Japanese strike groups simultaneously. As the first Japanese formation, 69 aircraft including 43 Zeros, approached the American fleet at 14,000 feet, Brewer's top division dove on them from 28,000 feet. The Japanese pilots never saw the attack coming. Diving Hellcats screamed down at terminal velocity, fired precise bursts into the tightly packed formation, then zoomed back to altitude before the stunned Japanese pilots could react. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu, flying from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes during this first interception. His combat report, filed hours later, described clinical efficiency. First target was a Judy dive bomber. 1 burst, 2 seconds, range 300 yards. Wings separated, bomber tumbled. Second target was a Zero escort. Longer burst, 3 seconds, 400 yards. Engine fire, pilot bailed out. Third target was another Judy trying to dive away. Followed him down, fired from 200 yards, saw hits on fuselage and wing root. Bomber exploded. Vrashu continued this pattern through for more kills before Winchester, running out of ammunition after expending all 2,400 rounds. The defensive engagement developed into 4 separate battles as successive Japanese strike groups approached the American fleet from different vectors. Each battle followed the same pattern. American radar detected the Japanese formation at maximum range, Hellcat divisions positioned for altitude advantage, then dove on the approaching aircraft with such speed and violence that Japanese formations disintegrated before reaching attack positions. Japanese dive bombers jettisoned their bombs to gain speed for escape. Japanese torpedo bombers broke formation and scattered. Zero escorts, already struggling to maintain formation integrity at combat altitudes where their engines lost power while Hellcat engines performed optimally, could provide no effective protection. The few Japanese aircraft that penetrated the Hellcat defensive screen faced anti-aircraft fire from the fleet's screening destroyers and cruisers. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched against Task Force 58 that day, 314 were shot down. 31 more were damaged so severely they crashed attempting to return to their carriers. Only 27 aircraft returned intact. American losses, 29 aircraft total, including only 6 Hellcats shot down by enemy fighters. The engagement was immediately dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by Hellcat pilots, comparing the one-sided slaughter to hunting defenseless game birds. Lieutenant, Junior Grade, Robert Duncan, who shot down 4 aircraft that day, captured the engagement's significance, we didn't just win a battle. We destroyed Japan's carrier aviation capability permanently. The pilots we killed over the Philippine Sea were the last generation of experienced Japanese naval aviators. The aircraft we destroyed couldn't be replaced. The carriers that launched them would never conduct effective operations again. This wasn't combat. This was industrial-scale execution of an enemy force that couldn't adapt fast enough to technological and tactical superiority. Japanese commanders analyzing combat reports from surviving pilots struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. The tactical concept had been sound: mass attacks to overwhelm defenses. The execution had been professional: pilots followed their training, maintained formation discipline, pressed attacks despite losses. But none of it mattered against an opponent with such overwhelming advantages in aircraft performance, radar-directed interception, and pilot skill enhanced by superior training and combat experience. Admiral Ozawa's after-action report contained a single sentence that summarized Japan's hopeless situation: the enemy's fighters are superior to ours in every measurable category. The Hellcat's guns, engineering lethality. The Grumman F6F Hellcat's primary armament, 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, represented the culmination of decades of weapons development and tactical evolution. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute, meaning all 6 guns collectively fired 4,800 rounds per minute or 80 rounds per second. A standard 1-second trigger pull sent 80 half-inch diameter projectiles, each weighing 45 grams and traveling at 2,900 feet per second, into a cone of airspace roughly 10 feet in diameter at 400 yards range. Any aircraft entering that cone of fire would be struck by dozens of projectiles in the span of a heartbeat. The ammunition loadout itself was carefully engineered for maximum effectiveness against aerial targets. Standard Hellcat ammunition belts alternated ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds in specific sequences. Ball rounds provided maximum penetration against aircraft structure. Armor-piercing rounds could punch through the armor, protecting enemy pilots and engines. Incendiary rounds, loaded with small charges that ignited on impact, would start fires in fuel tanks and hydraulic systems. Tracer rounds, loaded with burning chemical compounds that produced visible smoke trails, allowed pilots to observe their projectile paths and adjust aim in real time. The effectiveness of .50 caliber fire against Japanese aircraft was devastating. The Zero's construction, aluminum skin over aluminum frames with minimal protective plating, offered virtually no resistance to armor-piercing .50 caliber rounds. A single armor-piercing round striking a Zero's fuel tank would typically penetrate both walls of the tank, and the incendiary round that followed would ignite escaping fuel vapors. The resulting fire would consume the entire aircraft in seconds. Japanese pilots called .50 caliber fire Jigoku no Ame, rain from hell, because even a brief burst that missed the pilot could destroy their aircraft's ability to fly. Hellcat pilots developed refined firing techniques through months of combat experience. The standard shooting position was dead astern at 300 to 400 yards, with the target aircraft filling roughly half the gunsight ring. At this range, a 2-second burst, 160 rounds total, provided high probability of multiple hits while conserving ammunition for additional targets. Deflection shooting, firing at a target crossing the shooter's flight path, required leading the target by distances that varied with relative speed and crossing angle. Experienced pilots learned to estimate lead instinctively, placing their gunsight reticle ahead of the target by what appeared to be 2 or 3 aircraft lengths at typical combat speeds. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's all-time leading ace with 34 confirmed kills, described his firing discipline: new pilots would see a zero and empty all 6 guns at it from 600 yards, miss completely, and then be defenseless. I trained my squadron to hold fire until inside 400 yards, fire bursts of under 2 seconds, observe hits, fire again if necessary. Most kills required under 10 seconds total firing time. I shot down 9 aircraft in one mission and had ammunition remaining when I returned to the carrier. Accuracy, not volume, determined lethality. The mechanical reliability of the Browning M2 was equally critical. These guns had to function in extreme conditions: high-altitude cold, salt spray corrosion, vibration from the aircraft's engine, dust and debris on Pacific Island airstrips. The Hellcat's guns were mounted in the wings with breech mechanisms accessible through panels that allowed armament crews to clear jams and perform maintenance without removing the guns entirely. During intensive carrier operations, maintenance crews could reload all 6 guns and clear minor malfunctions in under 15 minutes, ensuring maximum aircraft availability for continuous combat operations. The gun harmonization, the convergence point where all 6 gun trajectories intersected, was typically set at 300 yards, creating maximum concentration of fire at the optimal shooting distance. Some pilots requested custom harmonization settings based on their personal shooting preferences. McCampbell preferred 250 yards, accepting tighter convergence in exchange for devastating hit density at close range. Other pilots preferred 350 yards, giving them effective fire at longer distances but with slightly dispersed shot patterns. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu, flying from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes during this first interception. His combat report, filed hours later, described clinical efficiency. First target was a Judy dive bomber. 1 burst, 2 seconds, range 300 yards. Wings separated, bomber tumbled. Second target was a Zero escort. Longer burst, 3 seconds, 400 yards. Engine fire, pilot bailed out. Third target was another Judy trying to dive away. Followed him down, fired from 200 yards, saw hits on fuselage and wing root. Bomber exploded. Vrashu continued this pattern through for more kills before Winchester, running out of ammunition after expending all 2,400 rounds. The defensive engagement developed into 4 separate battles as successive Japanese strike groups approached the American fleet from different vectors. Each battle followed the same pattern. American radar detected the Japanese formation at maximum range, Hellcat divisions positioned for altitude advantage, then dove on the approaching aircraft with such speed and violence that Japanese formations disintegrated before reaching attack positions. Japanese dive bombers jettisoned their bombs to gain speed for escape. Japanese torpedo bombers broke formation and scattered. Zero escorts, already struggling to maintain formation integrity at combat altitudes where their engines lost power while Hellcat engines performed optimally, could provide no effective protection. The few Japanese aircraft that penetrated the Hellcat defensive screen faced anti-aircraft fire from the fleet's screening destroyers and cruisers. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched against Task Force 58 that day, 314 were shot down. 31 more were damaged so severely they crashed attempting to return to their carriers. Only 27 aircraft returned intact. American losses, 29 aircraft total, including only 6 Hellcats shot down by enemy fighters. The engagement was immediately dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by Hellcat pilots, comparing the one-sided slaughter to hunting defenseless game birds. Lieutenant, Junior Grade, Robert Duncan, who shot down 4 aircraft that day, captured the engagement's significance. We didn't just win a battle. We destroyed Japan's carrier aviation capability permanently. The pilots we killed over the Philippine Sea were the last generation of experienced Japanese naval aviators. The aircraft we destroyed couldn't be replaced. The carriers that launched them would never conduct effective operations again. This wasn't combat. This was industrial-scale execution of an enemy force that couldn't adapt fast enough to technological and tactical superiority. Japanese commanders analyzing combat reports from surviving pilots struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. The tactical concept had been sound: mass attacks to overwhelm defenses. The execution had been professional: pilots followed their training, maintained formation discipline, pressed attacks despite losses. But none of it mattered against an opponent with such overwhelming advantages in aircraft performance, radar-directed interception, and pilot skill enhanced by superior training and combat experience. Admiral Ozawa's after-action report contained a single sentence that summarized Japan's hopeless situation: the enemy's fighters are superior to ours in every measurable category. The Hellcat's guns, engineering lethality. The Grumman F6F Hellcat's primary armament, 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, represented the culmination of decades of weapons development and tactical evolution. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute, meaning all 6 guns collectively fired 4,800 rounds per minute or 80 rounds per second. A standard 1-second trigger pull sent 80 half-inch diameter projectiles, each weighing 45 grams and traveling at 2,900 feet per second, into a cone of airspace roughly 10 feet in diameter at 400 yards range. Any aircraft entering that cone of fire would be struck by dozens of projectiles in the span of a heartbeat. The ammunition loadout itself was carefully engineered for maximum effectiveness against aerial targets. Standard Hellcat ammunition belts alternated ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds in specific sequences. Ball rounds provided maximum penetration against aircraft structure. Armor-piercing rounds could punch through the armor, protecting enemy pilots and engines. Incendiary rounds, loaded with small charges that ignited on impact, would start fires in fuel tanks and hydraulic systems. Tracer rounds, loaded with burning chemical compounds that produced visible smoke trails, allowed pilots to observe their projectile paths and adjust aim in real time. The effectiveness of .50 caliber fire against Japanese aircraft was devastating. The Zero's construction, aluminum skin over aluminum frames with minimal protective plating, offered virtually no resistance to armor-piercing .50 caliber rounds. A single armor-piercing round striking a Zero's fuel tank would typically penetrate both walls of the tank, and the incendiary round that followed would ignite escaping fuel vapors. The resulting fire would consume the entire aircraft in seconds. Japanese pilots called .50 caliber fire Jigoku no Ame, rain from hell, because even a brief burst that missed the pilot could destroy their aircraft's ability to fly. Hellcat pilots developed refined firing techniques through months of combat experience. The standard shooting position was dead astern at 300 to 400 yards, with the target aircraft filling roughly half the gunsight ring. At this range, a 2-second burst, 160 rounds total, provided high probability of multiple hits while conserving ammunition for additional targets. Deflection shooting, firing at a target crossing the shooter's flight path, required leading the target by distances that varied with relative speed and crossing angle. Experienced pilots learned to estimate lead instinctively, placing their gunsight reticle ahead of the target by what appeared to be 2 or 3 aircraft lengths at typical combat speeds. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's all-time leading ace with 34 confirmed kills, described his firing discipline: new pilots would see a zero and empty all 6 guns at it from 600 yards, miss completely, and then be defenseless. I trained my squadron to hold fire until inside 400 yards, fire bursts of under 2 seconds, observe hits, fire again if necessary. Most kills required under 10 seconds total firing time. I shot down 9 aircraft in one mission and had ammunition remaining when I returned to the carrier. Accuracy, not volume, determined lethality. The mechanical reliability of the Browning M2 was equally critical. These guns had to function in extreme conditions: high-altitude cold, salt spray corrosion, vibration from the aircraft's engine, dust and debris on Pacific Island airstrips. The Hellcat's guns were mounted in the wings with breech mechanisms accessible through panels that allowed armament crews to clear jams and perform maintenance without removing the guns entirely. During intensive carrier operations, maintenance crews could reload all 6 guns and clear minor malfunctions in under 15 minutes, ensuring maximum aircraft availability for continuous combat operations. The gun harmonization, the convergence point where all 6 gun trajectories intersected, was typically set at 300 yards, creating maximum concentration of fire at the optimal shooting distance. Some pilots requested custom harmonization settings based on their personal shooting preferences. McCampbell preferred 250 yards, accepting tighter convergence in exchange for devastating hit density at close range. Other pilots preferred 350 yards, giving them effective fire at longer distances but with slightly dispersed shot patterns. Combat camera footage from Hellcats, recovered from gun cameras mounted in the wing root, provided dramatic evidence of .50 caliber effectiveness. In one frequently analyzed sequence, a Hellcat pilot fires a 3-second burst at a zero at 300 yards range. The footage shows tracers walking up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. At the 2-second mark, the Zero's canopy shatters. At 2.5 seconds, visible structural damage appears on the wing root. At 3 seconds, the entire left wing separates from the fuselage and the aircraft tumbles out of frame. The Zero pilot never had time to bail out. From first bullet impact to structural failure took less than 2 seconds, testimony to both the Browning M2's rate of fire and the Zero's structural vulnerability. Aces and Angels, the men who flew the Hellcat. The Hellcat created aces at a rate unprecedented in naval aviation history. Of the Navy and Marine Corps 307 fighter aces during World War II, 300 flew Hellcats at some point in their combat careers. The aircraft's combination of survivability and lethality meant that skilled pilots could survive long enough to accumulate the 5 kills required for ace status, then continue flying combat missions and building their scores to levels that would have been impossible in earlier, more vulnerable aircraft. Commander David McCampbell's career exemplified the Hellcat's impact on ace production. McCampbell joined VF-15 aboard USS Essex in early 1944 with no combat experience. By October 1944, he had shot down 34 Japanese aircraft and damaged another 23, becoming the Navy's all-time leading ace. His single most remarkable mission occurred on October 24 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when he shot down 9 aircraft in a single engagement while his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, shot down 6 more. McCampbell's combat report from that mission described methodical execution, encountered 60+ enemy aircraft inbound to our fleet. Attacked from altitude advantage. Worked through the formation systematically, shooting down 7 Zeros and 2 Oscars over the course of 90 minutes. Expended all ammunition. Returned to carrier with 5 gallons fuel remaining. The psychological profile of successful Hellcat pilots revealed interesting patterns. Many top aces were not natural aggressive personalities but rather analytical thinkers who approached combat as a series of tactical problems to be solved efficiently. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, who developed the famous mowing machine formation tactics, described his mindset: "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to survive while killing as many enemy aircraft as possible with minimum risk." The Hellcat rewarded that approach. If you used your head, maintained altitude advantage, controlled engagement geometry, the Hellcat would keep you alive while you destroyed the enemy. Not all Hellcat pilots became aces, but the aircraft dramatically improved survival rates across the entire pilot population. Statistical analysis of Navy fighter squadrons showed that pilots flying Hellcats had a 73% probability of surviving their first 10 combat missions, compared to 41% for pilots flying Wildcats in 1942. The Hellcat's armor, self-sealing tanks, and structural strength meant that aircraft returning with damage that would have killed a Wildcat pilot landed safely. Lieutenant Junior Grade James Swope took a 20mm cannon shell through his engine that destroyed 3 cylinders, flew his Hellcat 70 miles back to the carrier on reduced power, and landed safely despite severe vibration from the damaged engine. He was flying another Hellcat on combat patrol 8 hours later. The bond between pilots and their Hellcats developed into something approaching affection. Pilots gave their aircraft names, painted kill markings on fuselages, treated their assigned aircraft as trusted partners rather than mere equipment. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashew named his Hellcat Lead Sled in recognition of its weight and flew it for 9 months and 87 combat missions. When VF-16 rotated back to the United States in November 1944, Vrashew requested permission to fly his personal aircraft back to Pearl Harbor rather than transferring to a replacement aircraft. His request was approved, and Lead Sled, bearing 19 kill markings and over 200 bullet and shrapnel holes that had been repaired during its service, was eventually donated to a war bond drive where it helped raise over $3 million. The Hellcat also produced 7 Medal of Honor recipients, the nation's highest military decoration. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch the Hare, who had scored the Navy's first ace against Zeros while flying a Wildcat, transitioned to Hellcats and developed night fighter tactics before being killed in action in November 1943. Commander David McCampbell received the Medal of Honor for his actions on October 24, 1944. Lieutenant Commander James Sweat shot down 7 aircraft in his first combat mission flying a Hellcat during the Battle of the Solomon Islands. Each of these men credited the Hellcat's design with enabling them to survive long enough to accomplish the actions that earned their decorations. Night fighters, Hellcats hunt in darkness. The development of night fighter Hellcats represented a technological leap that gave American forces 24-hour air superiority. Standard Hellcats were formidable in daylight but nearly blind at night. Japanese commanders exploited this limitation by conducting bombing raids exclusively at night, when American fighters couldn't effectively intercept. The solution was the F6F-3N and later F6F-5N night fighter variants, equipped with AN/APS-6 radar mounted in a fairing on the starboard wing that allowed pilots to detect and track enemy aircraft in complete darkness. Lieutenant Commander William Henry, leading the Navy's first dedicated night fighter squadron VF-N-76, described the challenge of night interception. Imagine flying at 300 miles per hour in pitch blackness, watching a tiny radar scope, trying to interpret electronic blips that represented enemy aircraft somewhere in the same airspace. You had to close to within 500 feet to visually acquire the target, make a positive identification to ensure you weren't shooting at a friendly aircraft, then maneuver into firing position while maintaining situational awareness in 3 dimensions with 0 visual references. It required completely different skills than daylight combat. The night Hellcats proved devastatingly effective. On June 19, 1944, the same day as the Marianas Turkey shoot, Lieutenant Commander Robert Baird intercepted and shot down 3 Japanese bombers attempting to attack American carriers under cover of darkness. His combat report detailed the engagement: detected first contact at 15 miles, 3 aircraft in formation. Close to visual range, identified as Betty bombers. Positioned astern of trailing aircraft, fired burst at 400 feet range. Bomber exploded. Second bomber broke formation, attempted evasive maneuvers. Followed using radar, regained visual contact, fired from 300 feet. Second bomber crashed into ocean. Third bomber dove to wavetop height. Pursued, maintained radar contact, closed to 200 feet, fired. Bomber disintegrated. Total engagement time, 8 minutes. Japanese pilots developed superstitious terror of the night-fighting Hellcats. They called them Kyowa Akuma, Black Devils, and believed they possessed supernatural abilities to see in darkness. The psychological impact of being hunted at night, when Japanese pilots had previously felt safe from American fighters, was profound. Japanese bomber crews began refusing to fly night missions, reporting sick or claiming mechanical problems with their aircraft. Some crews simply abandoned their aircraft before takeoff rather than face the night Hellcats. The technology that enabled night fighting was cutting edge for 1944. The AN/APS-6 radar had a maximum detection range of approximately 4 miles for a bomber-sized target, with effective tracking range of 2 to 3 miles. The radar scope was mounted on the instrument panel, glowing with a faint green phosphorescence that provided just enough light for the pilot to see the display without destroying his night vision. Pilots had to divide their attention between the radar scope, flight instruments, and the darkness outside the canopy while flying intercept courses that required precise navigation and speed control. Training night fighter pilots required months of specialized instruction. Pilots learned to interpret radar returns, distinguishing actual aircraft from ground clutter, weather returns, and electronic interference. They practiced intercept geometry, calculating closure rates and lead angles using mental arithmetic while flying. They developed the ability to visually acquire targets in near-total darkness based on subtle cues, the faint blue glow from exhaust flames, slightly darker silhouettes against star fields, the momentary reflection of moonlight off metal surfaces. The best night fighter pilots developed almost predatory instincts, sensing the presence of enemy aircraft even before radar confirmed contact. The Hellcat's adaptability from fighter to fighter bomber. While the Hellcat's primary mission was air superiority, its robust design and powerful engine made it an excellent fighter-bomber platform. The centerline hardpoint could carry a 2,000-pound bomb, or a single Mark 13 torpedo for anti-shipping strikes. The wing hardpoints could carry 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, that could destroy tanks, buildings, or small ships. This versatility meant that Hellcat squadrons could transition from air superiority missions to ground attack missions and back again within hours, providing fleet commanders with tactical flexibility impossible with specialized single-role aircraft. The effectiveness of Hellcat ground attack missions surprised both American and Japanese forces. During the Philippine campaign in October 1944, VFR-18 from USS Intrepid struck Japanese airfields on Luzon using bombs and rockets. The Hellcats dove from 8,000 feet, released bombs at 2,000 feet, pulled out at 1,000 feet, then made strafing runs with all 6 machine guns against parked aircraft and support facilities. The attack destroyed 43 Japanese aircraft on the ground, 3 fuel dumps, 2 ammunition storage buildings, and severely damaged 2 runways. Not a single Hellcat was lost to ground fire, despite the intense anti-aircraft defense around Manila. The HVAR, high-velocity aircraft rocket, proved particularly deadly in Hellcat hands. Each 5-inch rocket carried a warhead equivalent to a 5-inch naval gun shell and could penetrate several inches of armor. Hellcats could fire rockets individually or in volleys of all 6 simultaneously, creating devastating effects against point targets. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, Hellcats providing close air support for Marines used rockets to destroy Japanese bunkers and artillery positions that were holding up the ground advance. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert Wade, fired all 6 rockets into a reinforced concrete bunker entrance from 1,500 yards range while diving at 45 degrees. All 6 rockets entered the bunker opening in a span of less than 2 seconds. The resulting explosion collapsed the bunker and killed the estimated 40 Japanese soldiers inside. Torpedo-carrying Hellcats participated in some of the war's most important anti-shipping strikes. During Operation Hailstone, the massive carrier strike on Truk Lagoon, 6 Hellcats carried torpedoes against Japanese shipping in the anchorage. The Hellcat's speed and maneuverability made it superior to the slower, more vulnerable TBF Avenger torpedo bomber for strikes into heavily defended harbors. The Hellcats approached at wavetop height, released torpedoes at 800 yards range, then immediately pulled up and away at full power before defensive fire could track them. 5 of the 6 torpedoes hit their targets, sinking 2 transports and damaging a light cruiser. All 6 Hellcats returned safely. The transition between roles demonstrated the Hellcat pilot's versatility. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia described a single day's operations in December 1944, morning mission, combat air patrol, shot down 2 Zeros attacking our task force. Afternoon mission, strike on Manila Harbor carrying 2,000-pound bomb, destroyed a cargo ship. Evening mission, nocturnal harassment strike with rockets against Japanese positions on Luzon. 3 different missions, 3 different aircraft configurations, 3 different tactical situations. The Hellcat could do all of it competently. No other fighter in the Pacific had that operational flexibility. Industrial miracle, building Hellcats at impossible speed. The production of over 12,000 Hellcats in less than 3 years represented one of the most impressive industrial achievements of World War II. Grumman's Bethpage, Long Island facility was supplemented by a massive new factory in Calverton, Long Island that was built specifically for Hellcat production. At peak production in early 1945, the combined facilities were producing over 600 Hellcats per month, an average of 1 complete aircraft every 63 minutes, 24 hours per day, 7 days a week. The manufacturing process was revolutionary for its time. Grumman developed modular construction techniques where major assemblies, wings, fuselage sections, engine mounts, were built on separate assembly lines by specialized teams, then brought together for final assembly. This approach allowed different components to be manufactured simultaneously, dramatically reducing total production time. A Hellcat fuselage section that would have required 3 weeks to build using traditional construction methods could be completed in 5 days using modular assembly techniques. Quality control remained strict despite the incredible production pace. Every Hellcat underwent extensive testing before acceptance by Navy inspectors. The test process included ground engine runs at full power for 30 minutes to identify any mechanical problems, followed by a complete functional test of all systems, hydraulics, electrical, flight controls, weapons systems. Finally, each aircraft was test-flown by a Grumman test pilot who put it through a standardized routine that included high-speed dives, tight turns, stalls, and simulated combat maneuvers. Only after passing all these tests was a Hellcat accepted for military service. The workforce that built Hellcats reflected America's wartime social transformation. Women comprised over 40% of the production workers by 1944, performing jobs that had been exclusively male before the war. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, she was the actual person installing the 73,000 rivets required to assemble a single Hellcat airframe. African American workers, previously excluded from skilled manufacturing jobs, made up over 15% of the workforce and proved just as capable as their white counterparts despite racist predictions that they couldn't handle the technical complexity. The sheer scale of resources required for Hellcat production was staggering. Each aircraft required approximately 3 tons of aluminum, titanium, and steel alloy. 12,000 Hellcats consumed 36,000 tons of strategic metals. The electrical wiring in a single Hellcat totaled over 2 miles in length. 12,000 aircraft required almost 25,000 miles of specialized aviation-grade electrical wire. The hydraulic systems required exotic fluids that had to be manufactured to precise specifications to function at the extreme temperatures aircraft experienced in combat. Every Hellcat needed 263 separate instruments and gauges, from airspeed indicators to fuel pressure gauges. Supplying these components required a vast network of subcontractors across the United States. The logistical challenge of transporting finished Hellcats to combat zones was equally impressive. Hellcats were flown from Bethpage or Calverton to Norfolk, Virginia, where they were loaded aboard escort carriers for transport to Pearl Harbor, then redistributed to fleet carriers operating across the Pacific. The delivery pipeline typically took 3 to 4 weeks from factory acceptance to frontline squadron assignment. This meant that replacement aircraft destroyed in combat on a given day would be replaced by a new Hellcat that hadn't even been built yet when the original was shot down, a testament to the American industrial machine's ability to maintain continuous production flow. Japanese response, desperation and innovation. Japanese aircraft designers, analyzing combat reports that showed Hellcats destroying their aircraft at rates approaching 20 to 1, attempted to develop fighters that could compete with the American design. The Mitsubishi A7M Repu Hurricane was intended as the Zero successor, with armor protection, self-sealing tanks, and a more powerful engine. The Kawanishi N1K, the J Shiden, a Lightning, was adapted from a float-plane fighter into a land-based interceptor with heavy armament and good high-altitude performance. Both aircraft showed promise in testing and could match or exceed the Hellcat in specific performance categories. But Japanese industrial capacity couldn't produce these advanced aircraft in meaningful numbers. The A7M Repu never entered mass production, only 8 prototypes were built before the war ended. The N1K J Shiden was manufactured in limited numbers, approximately 1,400 aircraft total, compared to 12,000 Hellcats. Quality control problems plagued Japanese production. Engines failed prematurely. Weapons jammed. Structural failures occurred without warning. The same industrial weaknesses that prevented Japan from matching American production volumes also prevented them from maintaining the quality standards necessary for reliable combat aircraft. Japanese pilot training deteriorated catastrophically as the war progressed. In 1941 and 42, Japanese naval aviators received over 2 years of intensive training before combat deployment, producing highly skilled pilots who could exploit their aircraft's capabilities fully. By 1944, training time had dropped to less than 6 months. By 1945, some Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with under 100 hours total flight time, barely enough to safely operate their aircraft, let alone fight effectively against experienced Hellcat pilots with hundreds of combat hours. The quality gap between Japanese and American pilots became a force multiplier for the Hellcat's technological advantages. An experienced Hellcat pilot fighting an inexperienced Japanese pilot in a theoretically superior aircraft still won because pilot skill mattered more than aircraft performance. Lieutenant Commander John McCain, Jr., later a U.S. Senator and presidential candidate, described shooting down a Japanese fighter over Okinawa. He was flying a Frank, supposedly superior to the Zero, good speed and climb. But he flew like he'd never been in combat before. Made every mistake in the book, turned when he should have extended, climbed when he should have dove, tried to dogfight when he should have run. I shot him down in under 30 seconds. Felt bad about it afterward, he never had a chance. Japanese tactics evolved toward increasingly desperate measures as the war situation deteriorated. Ramming attacks, where Japanese pilots intentionally crashed their aircraft into American aircraft or ships, became more common. The formal kamikaze program, beginning in October 1944, represented the ultimate admission of Japanese aerial combat failure. If skilled pilots in good aircraft couldn't defeat American forces through conventional combat, perhaps barely-trained pilots in barely functional aircraft could at least cause damage through suicide attacks. The Hellcat proved effective against kamikazes too, using its speed advantage to intercept the suicide aircraft before they reached the American fleet, shooting them down at ranges where exploding aircraft couldn't hit anything important. Okinawa, the Hellcat's last great battle. The Battle of Okinawa, April through June 1945, represented the Hellcat's final major combat operation and its most comprehensive demonstration of air superiority. American forces invading Okinawa faced the largest kamikaze offensive of the war, over 1,900 suicide attacks involving kamikaze aircraft, plus conventional bombing and strafing attacks by aircraft attempting to survive long enough to return to base. The defense of the invasion fleet and ground forces depended entirely on Hellcat combat air patrols that operated continuously, day and night, for 82 days. The operational intensity was unprecedented. Hellcat squadrons flew up to 5 missions per day, with individual pilots sometimes flying 3 missions totaling over 10 hours of flight time in a single day. Maintenance crews worked around the clock performing battle damage repair, routine maintenance, and engine changes. The average time between major overhaul for Hellcat engines dropped from the specified 150 hours to under 100 hours due to the stress of continuous high-power operations. Grumman engineers, monitoring these statistics from Long Island, marveled that their design was withstanding operational stresses beyond anything anticipated during development. The combat air patrol tactics developed for Okinawa involved multiple layers of Hellcats stationed at different altitudes and distances from the fleet. The outer patrol, designated Jack Patrol, operated 50 to 70 miles from the fleet and engaged incoming Japanese aircraft before they could form up for coordinated attacks. The middle patrol, Victor Patrol, caught aircraft that penetrated the outer screen. The inner patrol, Charlie Patrol, provided last-ditch defense immediately over the fleet. This defensive system, guided by radar direction from picket destroyers and the fleet's combat information centers, created concentric rings of Hellcat defenders that made it almost impossible for Japanese aircraft to reach attack positions. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia's Flying Circus, a division of Hellcats that developed extraordinary teamwork and tactics, exemplified Hellcat effectiveness at Okinawa. On April 16, Valencia's division intercepted a massive Japanese attack involving over 160 aircraft. The division engaged continuously for over 90 minutes, using coordinated tactics where one pair of Hellcats would engage while the other pair maintained altitude for follow-up attacks. When the engagement ended, the flying circus had shot down 14 Japanese aircraft without losing a single Hellcat or even sustaining battle damage. Valencia described the engagement: "We operated like a well-oiled machine. Everyone knew their role, trusted their wingmen, executed tactics we'd refined over months of combat. The Japanese had numbers, but we had everything else: better aircraft, better tactics, better training, better coordination." The statistical results from Okinawa demonstrated Hellcat dominance at its peak. In 82 days of continuous operations, Hellcats shot down over 760 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat while losing only 43 Hellcats to enemy fighters, a kill ratio of over 17-1. When losses to anti-aircraft fire and operational accidents were included, the overall attrition rate for Hellcat squadrons was still less than 5%, meaning that 95% of Hellcats that deployed to Okinawa at the war's beginning were still operational when it ended. This sustainability, combined with combat effectiveness, meant that Hellcat air superiority actually increased as the campaign progressed rather than degrading due to cumulative losses. The final tally: numbers that tell a story. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Hellcat's combat record was unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. Grumman had produced 12,275 Hellcats in just under 3 years. Navy and Marine Corps pilots flying Hellcats had destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter type in any theater. The overall kill ratio was 19-1, meaning that for every Hellcat lost to enemy fighters, 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. No other fighter aircraft in World War II, including the vaunted German Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the British Supermarine Spitfire, achieved comparable statistical dominance. The impact on Japanese combat capability was catastrophic. At the war's beginning, Japan possessed approximately 3,500 combat-ready naval aircraft and pilots trained to operate them effectively. By August 1945, Japanese naval aviation had essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The aircraft were gone, destroyed in combat or on the ground. The pilots were gone, killed in action or so poorly trained they were ineffective. The industrial capacity to replace losses was gone, bombed into rubble or starved of resources. The Hellcat, more than any other single weapon system, had achieved this destruction. American pilot casualties in Hellcat squadrons were remarkably low given the intensity of combat operations. Of the approximately 6,800 pilots who flew Hellcats in combat, approximately 270 were killed in action, a casualty rate of under 4%. This compared to casualty rates exceeding 20% for pilots flying earlier generation fighters like the Wildcat or Brewster Buffalo. The Hellcat's armor, structural strength, and combat effectiveness created a survivability advantage that saved thousands of American lives. The cost differential between American and Japanese losses told its own story. A Hellcat cost approximately $50,000 to manufacture in 1945, including engine and equipment. Training a Navy fighter pilot to combat-ready status cost approximately $50,000 in instructor time, fuel, maintenance, and facility expenses. Total investment per combat-ready Hellcat pilot with aircraft, $100,000. That pilot, on average, would destroy over 10 enemy aircraft worth approximately $200,000 total, plus the enemy pilots flying them who represented over $500,000 in Japanese training investment each. The economic return on investment for the Hellcat program exceeded 5-1, every dollar invested in Hellcats destroyed over $5 of enemy combat capability. Legacy: the Hellcat's place in history. The Grumman F6F Hellcat served with distinction until the end of World War II and continued in reserve and training roles for several years afterward. The last operational Hellcats were retired from Navy Reserve squadrons in 1954, 9 years after the war's end. Several Hellcats were converted to target drones for surface-to-air missile testing, where their rugged construction made them ideal for absorbing near-miss damage during test events. A handful were sold to foreign nations, including France and Uruguay, where they served in secondary roles until the late 1950s. Today, approximately 40 Hellcats survive in museums and private collections around the world. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum displays a night fighter F6F-3N that shot down 3 Japanese aircraft. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida has several Hellcats, including Commander David McCampbell's personal aircraft. The Commemorative Air Force maintains several airworthy Hellcats that still fly at airshows, demonstrating the design's enduring reliability over 70 years after manufacture. The Hellcat's influence on post-war fighter design was significant but subtle. The emphasis on pilot protection through armor and structural strength became standard for American military aircraft. The concept of designing aircraft to fit into existing operational infrastructure rather than requiring new facilities and procedures influenced Navy aircraft development for decades. The statistical approach to analyzing combat effectiveness and identifying design improvements based on field data became standard practice across the defense industry. Veterans who flew the Hellcat maintain fierce loyalty to the aircraft decades after their service. Annual reunions of Hellcat pilot associations draw attendees into their 90s and beyond. These men, who flew combat missions over hostile territory 7 decades ago, still speak with emotion about the aircraft that brought them home safely from conditions that killed so many of their friends in earlier, less capable fighters. Captain Arthur Singer, Navy retired, who flew Hellcats at the Marianas and Leyte Gulf, summarized the veteran perspective: the Hellcat gave us a fighting chance. Before it arrived, we were dying in inferior aircraft against a superior enemy. After it arrived, we had the best fighter in the Pacific. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't graceful. But it was tough, it was powerful, and it won the war. Conclusion: from mockery to mastery. The journey from Pearl Harbor's humiliation to Tokyo Bay's surrender took less than 4 years. In that compressed time frame, American industrial might, engineering skill, and tactical innovation transformed defeat into overwhelming victory. The Grumman F6F Hellcat stood at the center of that transformation, embodying the shift from defensive desperation to offensive dominance. German pilots initially laughed at the PA-47 Thunderbolt, just as Japanese pilots initially dismissed American carrier aircraft as inferior imitations of Japanese designs. Both groups learned the same painful lesson: underestimating American industrial capacity and engineering pragmatism was a fatal mistake. The Hellcat wasn't designed to be the most elegant fighter or the highest performing aircraft in specific performance metrics. It was designed to kill enemy aircraft while keeping its pilot alive, to be manufactured in overwhelming numbers, to be maintained under primitive conditions, and to win the war. It succeeded completely. The Zero, which had seemed invincible in December 1941, was revealed as a brilliantly flawed design that sacrificed survivability for performance. Japanese pilots, initially supremely confident in their equipment and training, found themselves outmatched by American pilots in superior aircraft backed by unlimited industrial production. The mathematical reality was inescapable: Japan couldn't train pilots fast enough to replace losses, couldn't build aircraft fast enough to match American production, couldn't develop new designs fast enough to overcome the Hellcat's advantages. The sound of Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, producing their distinctive deep thunder as Hellcat formations approached Japanese positions, became synonymous with American air superiority. Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands learned to recognize that sound and seek whatever cover they could find. Japanese pilots learned to fear it, knowing that the approaching Hellcats likely meant their last mission. Japanese commanders learned to despair at it, understanding that air superiority had shifted irreversibly to an enemy with resources and industrial capacity beyond anything they could counter. In the end, the Hellcat wrote the final chapter of Pacific air combat not through elegant maneuvers or individual heroics, though it enabled plenty of both, but through relentless, systematic destruction of Japanese air power. 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed. 19-to-1 kill ratio. 12,275 Hellcats produced. These numbers tell a story of industrial warfare at its most effective, the American engineering and manufacturing capacity applied with focused intensity to create a weapon system that achieved complete dominance over its operational environment. The Japanese pilots who survived the war, in their rare interviews about combat experiences, consistently identified the arrival of the Hellcat as the moment they knew the war was lost. Not the atomic bombs, not the Soviet declaration of war, not even the firebombing of Japanese cities, but the appearance of swarms of Hellcats over Pacific battlefields, unstoppable, unkillable, endlessly replacing their losses while Japanese aircraft and pilots disappeared forever into the ocean or jungle. The Zero had ruled Pacific skies for 18 months. The Hellcat ruled them for the next 3 years, and that dominance was absolute, undeniable, and ultimately decisive in determining the war's outcome. Grumman's engineers had been given an impossible assignment: build a fighter that could defeat the Zero in every combat scenario. They delivered an aircraft that didn't just defeat the Zero, it made the Zero obsolete, turned Japanese air superiority into a memory, and helped transform American naval aviation from embattled underdog to overwhelming dominant force. The German pilots who laughed at the P-47 learned to fear it. The Japanese pilots who dismissed early American fighters learned to fear the Hellcat even more. Both learned the same lesson: mockery turns to terror when American industrial power decides to win.